Imagine a world where half the people you know are gone within months. Streets echo with silence, church bells toll endlessly, and the fields lie untended as entire villages vanish overnight. This was Europe during the Black Death, the deadliest plague in history. But beyond the horror, it tore apart the old feudal order, giving rise to freedoms and changes no one expected. Tonight, let's journey through the plague years and see how one unseen enemy reshaped the entire world. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe. But if you really like what I'm doing here, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? It's always happy to see who is joining us from around the world. So dim your light, let the world quiet down, and get comfortable. We begin in silence. Whispers of Pestilence. 1346. In the year 1346, the world still felt steady to those who lived along the great trade routes. Merchants rose before dawn to prepare their caravans, leading donkeys and camels laden with silks, spices, and bolts of woolen cloth. Ships creaked at their moorings in the bustling harbours of the Mediterranean, waiting for a favourable wind to carry them toward distant ports. Kings and emperors planned their campaigns, while peasants bent their backs to plough fields that had been worked for centuries. To the eyes of ordinary men and women, the rhythms of medieval life seemed enduring, as though the same customs and duties would continue without change for generations to come. Yet unseen beneath these familiar patterns was the quiet approach of something terrible, an enemy that did not march beneath banners or swear allegiance to any crown. It began far from Europe, across the great stretches of Central Asia where steppes rolled beneath open skies. Chroniclers later wrote that the pestilence had first emerged somewhere near the lands of the Mongols, perhaps in the trading towns that thrived between China and the Black Sea. In these outposts, where merchants exchanged silk for silver and furs for spices, there were whispers of sudden deaths. Travellers reported strange fevers and swellings, but such tales seemed distant, as remote as stories of storms in another land. The movement of people and goods, however, did not respect distance. Caravan by caravan, ship by ship, the contagion crept steadily westward, borne unknowingly by those who traded, travelled, or fought. The year 1346 was also a year of war. In the east, the Mongol Golden Horde laid siege to the Crimean port of Kaffa, a Genoese stronghold on the Black Sea. It was here, some chroniclers believed, that the pestilence made one of its decisive leaps toward Europe. Soldiers in the besieging army fell sick with terrible speed. They burned with fever, their bodies covered in dark swellings that oozed and split. The air itself seemed poisoned around the camp. Some accounts even told of bodies flung over the city walls by catapult, a grotesque act of early biological warfare. Though whether this detail was true or embellished by rumour, it spoke to the horror of the disease. For the people trapped within Kaffa, the sight of death outside their walls was terrifying enough. But when the sickness spread inside as well, they knew escape was their only chance. In hurried desperation, Genoese merchants boarded their ships, abandoning the city to sail for safer harbours. They carried with them not only cargoes of cloth, grain and spices, but also the hidden passengers that would doom Europe, rats crawling in the holds, their fur alive with fleas that carried the plague bacillus. The sailors did not know. They raised their sails and prayed for favourable winds, imagining that distance would save them from the sickness. But the pestilence had already found its way aboard. Meanwhile, across Europe, life moved in its accustomed cycles. In England, King Edward III pressed his claims in the 100 Years' War with France. In Italy, wealthy city-states like Florence and Venice prospered, their merchants growing fat from trade and their bankers lending money to kings and popes. On the manors and in the villages, peasants planted and harvested, bound by the obligations of feudal service to their lords. Few could have imagined how fragile these systems were, how swiftly they could unravel when labour itself became scarce. To the men and women of 1346, The bonds of feudalism felt eternal, the only order they had ever known. And yet, across the roads and rivers of Asia, stories filtered in like shadows before a storm. Pilgrims returning from the Holy Land whispered of caravans wiped out by sudden disease. Venetian traders, ever alert for shifts in fortune, heard rumours in Constantinople of sickness spreading in the east. Even in the courts of Europe, where nobles discussed alliances and inheritances, faint echoes of fear began to stir. But fear was easily dismissed. Europe had suffered before famines, wars, even outbreaks of leprosy. This, they thought, would pass as well. The year slipped forward. In autumn, when leaves browned and harvests were gathered in, the first Genoese ships began their westward journeys. They crossed the Black Sea, stopping at ports that welcomed their goods and, unknowingly, their disease. From Trebizond to Constantinople, the pestilence followed. In 1346, Constantinople was a proud but weakened city, still glittering with churches and palaces, yet diminished from its imperial heights. When plague struck, the people were unprepared. Corpses soon crowded the streets. Priests chanted prayers in ceaseless funerals, and citizens who could fled inland, carrying the disease with them. Still, to much of Europe this seemed remote. News travelled slowly, carried by merchants, sailors, and the occasional letter. Many dismissed the stories as exaggerations. Life went on. Fairs opened in the market towns, coins changed hands at the counting tables, peasants gathered around fires at night to share bread and ale. But just as rats scurried unseen in granaries and storehouses, so too did the future disaster creep quietly, waiting for its moment to strike. By winter's end, the pestilence was poised. The ships that had fled Kaffa had touched ports across the Mediterranean. Their crews carried infection into Messina, into Genoa, into Venice. In 1346, the whispers had been faint, little more than distant echoes of an unseen threat. But by the spring of 1347, those whispers would become cries, and cries would turn into wails of mourning as Europe entered its darkest age. For now, the story paused in its shadowed beginning. Fields still yielded wheat, bells still rang in church towers, and kings still rode out with banners unfurled. The air of 1346 was thick with a deceptive normality, but beneath it all, history's tide was already shifting. The plague was moving, and with it came the slow unravelling of feudal bonds, though none yet could know. The ships of death, 1347. The year 1347 opened with sails unfurled across the Mediterranean. Ships moved ceaselessly between ports, their wooden hulls heavy with grain, wine, oil, cloth, and precious cargoes destined for markets that linked Europe, North Africa, and Asia together. These ships, symbols of prosperity and connection, also became the most efficient carriers of death in history, for hidden within their holds scuttled rats, and on the bodies of those rats clung fleas bearing the plague bacterium Yersinia pestis. The sailors, merchants, and pilgrims who boarded them believed they were voyaging toward fortune or faith, but in truth they carried a silent contagion that would alter the course of Europe forever. When the Genoese ships fled the besieged port of Kaffa in late 1346, their crews already showed signs of sickness. Sailors staggered on deck, their necks and armpits swelling with buboes that turned black and oozed. Fever burned through them. Some collapsed and never rose again. The ships that limped toward Sicily brought with them more than weary men. They bore the Black Death itself into Europe's heart. Messina was the first to feel it. The people of that bustling Sicilian port were accustomed to ships bringing wealth, news, and sometimes trouble, but nothing like this. When the Genoese vessels arrived, they begged entry, desperate for food and shelter. Within days, the city was overwhelmed. Chroniclers later wrote that entire households perished in a matter of days. Priests rang bells for the dead until their arms grew weak. Funeral processions clogged the narrow streets, but soon even the gravediggers succumbed. The citizens, terrified, tried to drive the ships away, believing the foreigners had cursed them, but it was already too late. The contagion had entered the town, and the rats had scurried ashore, carrying fleas into storehouses, cellars, and kitchens. From Sicily, the ships pressed on. Some sailed north to Genoa, the proud city-state from which many of the merchants hailed. Genoa had long thrived on maritime power, its docks filled with tall galleys and merchant cogs. In 1347, its wealth glittered in the palaces of its bankers and the marble facades of its churches, yet all that strength meant nothing against the invisible plague. Within weeks of the ship's arrival, Genoa reeled. Families locked themselves indoors, neighbours refused to help one another, and the air filled with the ceaseless tolling of bells. Some citizens attempted to flee into the countryside, believing distance would protect them. They carried the infection into villages and farms, spreading death further. Venice was next, a city woven out of water and stone, its canals alive with merchants and its markets bursting with goods from the east. Venetians prided themselves on their careful governance and shrewd trade, but even their vigilance could not bar the way. A single infected sailor, a single rat leaping from a ship into the warren of warehouses along the Grand Canal, was enough to unleash catastrophe. The plague devoured the city. Chroniclers described bodies left in gondolas to drift until collected, corpses piled outside doors, and the sick abandoned to die alone in houses where even family dared not enter. The government attempted one of history's first quarantines, isolating arriving ships on outlying islands, but the measure came too late. By the end of 1347, Venice was staggering under the weight of mortality. Florence, too, was touched by the pestilence that year. The great city of Dante, famed for its woolen cloth and its golden florins, saw its thriving streets fall into silence. Giovanni Boccaccio, who would later write the Decameron, described with chilling clarity how the disease struck. Buboes appeared in the groin and under the arms. Victims burned with fever and coughed blood. Death often came within 3 days. He noted how bonds of love and duty dissolved. Fathers abandoned children, wives abandoned husbands. For fear of contagion, bodies lay untended until they could be dragged into pits. The death carts clattered day and night, a grim rhythm to a city undone. As 1347 closed, the pestilence had carved a jagged path across southern Europe. Sicily, Genoa, Venice, Florence, all were struck in quick succession, but the ships did not stop there. They sailed west to Marseille, north to Pisa, Barcelona and Majorca, carrying the plague wherever the winds and trade demanded. No port was safe. Merchants who had once been welcomed with open arms now carried dread in their wake. Wherever sails appeared on the horizon, whispers of death followed. The sheer speed of the contagion shocked contemporaries. In an age when news travelled slowly by letter, by horse, by word of mouth, the plague seemed to move with unnatural swiftness. People believed it was a curse from God, a punishment for sins too great to name. Others thought it spread through poisoned air, corrupted by planetary alignments or the foul breath of the east. Few suspected the rats, gnawing silently at grain sacks, slipping unnoticed from dock to dock. The year 1347, then, was the beginning of Europe's great descent. For centuries, the structure of feudalism had bound lord to serf, manor to peasant, service to duty. Fields had been tilled, rents paid, and armies raised according to these ancient customs. But plague cared nothing for custom. It struck down lord and serf alike. It left lands untilled, houses abandoned, and entire parishes devoid of life. The very foundations of labour, which had kept feudalism intact, began to crumble. In the countryside, peasants whispered of villages gone silent. A farmer might travel to market only to find it shuttered, the stalls empty, the streets eerily still. Stories spread of priests too afraid to administer last rites, of doctors who refused to visit the sick, of ships drifting into harbour crewed only by corpses. Fear seeped into every corner of daily life. Yet amid terror, there were those who tried to endure. Some turned to prayer, crowding churches and monasteries, seeking divine mercy. Others embraced extremes, joining processions of flagellants who whipped their backs bloody in public squares, believing suffering might appease heaven. Still others sought earthly scapegoats. In some cities, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells or conjuring the plague, and massacres followed. Fear and grief, mingled with desperation, produced cruelty as well as piety. By the close of 1347, the ships had delivered their grim cargo far beyond Italy. Southern France reeled, Spain trembled, and still the vessels sailed, for trade did not cease. Merchants hoped to outrun the pestilence, to reach ports untainted, but in their flight they became its carriers. In this way, the Mediterranean itself became a map of death, its waters crisscrossed by paths of contagion. From Constantinople to Messina, from Genoa to Marseille, from Venice to Barcelona, the plague had laid its foundation. The coming year would see it climb further north, into the heart of Europe, where it would devastate England, Germany, and beyond. The ships of 1347 had accomplished what armies could not. They had breached every frontier, carried by winds and waters, until no land seemed beyond their reach. Europe's fate was sealed, though no one yet understood. The year that had begun with prosperous sails ended with harbours of silence, bells tolling endlessly, and the first cracks forming in the order that had governed medieval life for centuries. The ships had delivered more than cargo. They had delivered a new age, one of mourning, of upheaval, and eventually of transformation. The pestilence unleashed, 1348. The year 1348 opened with ominous silence in many towns along the Mediterranean. The pestilence that had first appeared the year before had not receded with the winter winds. Instead, as spring dawned and ships resumed their journeys with greater frequency, the Black Death pressed deeper into the heart of Europe. If 1347 was the year of whispers, rumours, and first encounters with horror, 1348 was the year when the plague revealed its full force, surging like a tide no barrier could restrain. From the south of France, the disease spread with terrifying speed. In Marseille, one of Europe's busiest ports, the streets that had once been thick with merchants, sailors, and artisans became graveyards. Chroniclers noted that more than half of the city perished within a few months. The markets emptied, the cries of fishmongers and bakers gave way to the constant toll of bells for the dead. Along the Provençal countryside, fields grew wild because labourers fell before the harvest. Villages shrank to shadows of themselves, their wells choked with weeds, their churches echoing with unanswered prayers. By early 1348, the contagion had crossed into Spain. Barcelona, proud jewel of the Crown of Aragon, felt its vigour drained away in weeks. Traders from across the Mediterranean, who once filled its harbours with the colourful sails of commerce, instead brought the taint of sickness. The court itself was not spared. King Alfonso XI of Castile fell to the plague while on campaign, the only reigning European monarch to die in the pandemic. His death symbolised how the disease cared nothing for power or privilege. Lords, knights, peasants, priests, all found themselves equally vulnerable to the invisible hand of pestilence. Florence, too, met its darkest year in 1348. Already shaken by the previous months, it now experienced devastation beyond imagining. Giovanni Boccaccio, the Florentine writer, captured the horrors in prose that would become immortal. He described how swelling buboes, appearing under arms and in the groin, marked the sick, and how black spots spread across their bodies as if their very flesh were rotting while they lived. Bloodied coughs announced the end, and within 3 days most were gone. Boccaccio observed that fear drove people apart. Fathers abandoned children, wives fled husbands, and even priests recoiled from the dying. Love itself, the strongest of human bonds, seemed to dissolve under the weight of terror. His testimony provides not just history but a mirror into the fractured soul of a city undone. Florence's economy collapsed almost overnight. The wool trade that had made the city famous languished, its weavers and dyers dead or too frightened to leave home. Bankers shuttered their counting houses, and gold florins lay idle. Streets, once loud with laughter and quarrels, grew silent but for the rumble of death carts. Corpses were carried to pits, buried in haste without ceremony. The communal rituals that bound society together, baptisms, weddings, funerals, faltered. Without them, people felt unmoored, as though even time itself had stopped. Northward, the plague moved through the Alps, scaling passes that armies once struggled to cross. By summer of 1348, it reached Switzerland and southern Germany. Towns along the Rhine and Danube trembled. Reports told of half the populations of Strasbourg, Basel and Vienna swept away. Commerce along the great rivers faltered as merchants refused to travel, fearful of contagion in unfamiliar towns. Isolation seemed the only refuge, yet even the most careful villagers discovered that death crept in with traders, with fugitives, with rats slipping through storehouses. England, too, braced for the pestilence in 1348. It arrived at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, carried by ships from Gascony. Within weeks, the disease had spread inland. The fertile countryside, dotted with villages tied to manorial lords, saw its first cases in late summer. Families huddled together in cottages, watching helplessly as the swelling buboes disfigured loved ones. Priests hurried between parishes, blessing the dying, but many themselves perished. The plague spread steadily toward London, leaving devastation in its wake. London, in 1348, was the beating heart of the English realm. Its markets teemed with goods from across Europe, its wharves crowded with ships. But by the year's end, the capital was transformed. Eyewitnesses recorded the dead lying in heaps outside parish churches, too numerous for burial. Cemeteries filled until new grounds were consecrated, most famously at Smithfield, where acres of land were turned into plague pits. Chroniclers described how carts moved constantly, loaded with bodies, while the air itself felt heavy with death. Rumours spread that the very breath of the sick poisoned the healthy. People stuffed herbs into their clothing or clutched posies of flowers, hoping sweet scents would ward off corruption. The nursery rhyme of "ring-a-ring-a roses," centuries later, would be linked in legend to these desperate gestures. As the disease surged, social order faltered everywhere. Lords could no longer collect dues from serfs who had died. Manor courts fell silent. In many places, animals wandered untended. Sheep and cattle roamed into abandoned fields. Wolves, rare in some parts of Europe, returned to hunt amid the silence. Chroniclers in France spoke of villages so empty that only the wind and the church bell remained. Fear of contagion reshaped human behaviour in every corner of Europe. People ceased gathering in taverns, markets and churches. Entire towns shut their gates, posting guards to keep strangers out. Yet fear could not hold the pestilence at bay. It seemed to seep through walls and borders alike, defying every attempt at containment. Alongside fear came superstition. Many believed the plague was a punishment from God. Astrologers claimed the alignment of Saturn, Jupiter and Mars in 1345 had corrupted the air. Doctors prescribed bloodletting or strange concoctions of herbs and gems, but their efforts proved useless. In desperation, processions of flagellants moved through Germany and the Low Countries, whipping themselves in public squares, believing their suffering might atone for the sins of humanity. Their chants and cries echoed through towns, a haunting counterpoint to the silence of the dead. Tragically, scapegoating followed close behind. Jewish communities, long vulnerable to suspicion, were accused of poisoning wells. In 1348 and 1349, massacres swept across parts of Europe. In Strasbourg, hundreds of Jews were burned alive, while survivors were driven from their homes. Such violence revealed the depths of fear and the ease with which panic could turn to cruelty. The Black Death was not only a biological catastrophe but also a social one, exposing fault lines of prejudice that ran through medieval society. By the close of 1000, 348, the plague had swept from the Mediterranean to the heart of the continent. Few regions were untouched. From Spain to England, from Italy to Germany, the pestilence consumed lives at a scale no living generation had known. Mortality rates reached staggering heights. In many places, 1 in 3, sometimes 1 in 2, were gone. The survivors stumbled forward in a world unrecognizable, where half the faces they had once known were missing. The year 1348 thus stands as the moment when the Black Death ceased to be a local horror and became a European cataclysm. It spared no kingdom, no city, no village. Its path was unpredictable yet relentless, touching coast and hinterland alike. The pestilence had unleashed itself fully upon the continent, and the Europe that emerged on the other side would never be the same. Collapse of daily life, 1348-1349. When the plague moved past its first great waves of devastation in 1348, Europe was already reeling, but by 1349, the effects were not only counted in the bodies laid in plague pits, but also in the collapse of everyday life. The rhythms that had given order to the medieval world, harvests and markets, feast days and fast days, marriages and baptisms, were thrown into disorder. Life itself no longer moved forward with the same reassuring patterns. Instead, across towns and villages, people woke each day with the same haunting question: who will still be alive by nightfall? Markets, once the beating heart of medieval communities, became deserted. In London, chroniclers recorded that the great market squares lay still, their stalls abandoned, their goods rotting. The familiar clamour of hucksters calling out their wares was replaced by the silence of shuttered stalls and the tolling of bells. Bakers no longer baked, for their apprentices were dead. Butchers had no meat to sell because drovers feared travelling across diseased countryside. Even when goods were available, fear kept buyers away. To brush against another person's sleeve, to touch a coin that had passed through too many hands, felt like courting death itself. Rural life fared no better. In France, entire villages disappeared, their inhabitants carried away by the pestilence or fled into the woods and hills. Chroniclers noted that fields lay untilled, harvests spoiled in the fields, and vineyards rotted unpicked. Without peasants to plough, sow, and reap, lords could not collect rents or fulfill obligations to their overlords. Horses wandered, unshod and unbridled, and oxen lowed in empty barns. Sheep multiplied, oddly unchecked, until in England their numbers became so vast that later historians remarked upon the strange sight of fields filled with animals, but not with men. Death was not the only destroyer of daily life. Fear, just as potent, reshaped society. The natural bonds that once held families together began to fray. Boccaccio in Florence spoke of fathers abandoning children, wives leaving husbands, and siblings refusing to bury one another. What had once been unthinkable, turning away from one's own blood, became common when the price of compassion might be one's own life. Yet alongside these stories of abandonment were others of courage, of those who stayed to nurse the sick despite the danger. Some priests and nuns gave their lives in service, tending to the dying even when their own hands shook with fever. The collapse of burial practices revealed the depth of the crisis. Across Europe, cemeteries overflowed. In Avignon, the papal city, so many bodies were brought to be buried that the Pope ordered new pits dug and consecrated by the hundreds. In London, the vast new ground at Smithfield filled rapidly, with thousands interred in mass graves. In Strasbourg, bodies were piled in trenches, covered with lime to quicken decomposition. The old rituals, candles lit at the bedside, a priest giving the last rites, a funeral procession with hymns were impossible when hundreds died each day. Death had become too common, too overwhelming for ritual to contain it. With so many artisans and labourers gone, urban life suffered a paralysis. Guilds, which had once structured the crafts and trades of medieval towns, lost members in shocking numbers. Masters found themselves without apprentices, apprentices without masters. In Florence, the wool industry, backbone of the city's wealth, faltered, and even when survivors sought to rebuild, the lack of skilled hands slowed every effort. In Paris, masons and carpenters lay dead, leaving cathedrals unfinished and houses unbuilt. The once proud hum of productive towns was reduced to a ghostly quiet broken only by funeral bells. Amid this devastation, fear of strangers grew. Communities, once open to trade and travel, shut their gates. In Italian city-states, guards were posted at walls to turn away travellers who might bring infection. In England, villages barred roads with chains or felled trees, blocking anyone from entering. But the plague cared nothing for boundaries. It slipped through the smallest gaps, travelling with a merchant, a pilgrim, a fleeing servant, or simply in the fur of a rat clambering onto a new cart of grain. Attempts at quarantine slowed its spread only slightly, never halting it. Religion, the backbone of medieval life, was shaken to its core. Churches filled with the frightened, kneeling for hours in smoky halls lit with flickering candles. Priests intoned prayers for deliverance, yet their flocks watched them fall one by one. In some places, entire monasteries were emptied of monks. The faithful struggled with profound questions. Why would God allow such suffering? Was the plague divine punishment, or the work of malevolent forces? Astrologers pointed to conjunctions of planets. Others whispered of poisoned wells or bad air. Superstition flourished where knowledge failed. Yet not all responded with fear alone. Some communities clung more tightly to ritual. In Germany and the Low Countries, flagellant groups marched barefoot through towns, lashing themselves with whips until blood ran down their backs. They believed their suffering might atone for the sins of the world and win God's mercy. Crowds gathered to watch, joining in chants that mingled pain and hope. Authorities, however, soon turned against them, fearing their processions spread panic and violence. The scapegoating of minorities brought further collapse of order. In 1349, Strasbourg saw the mass burning of its Jewish community, accused falsely of spreading the plague through poison. Pogroms erupted in Mainz, Cologne, and other cities along the Rhine. Centuries of coexistence were undone in weeks of fury. Where fear had broken families, it also shattered communities, leaving scars of mistrust that endured long after the plague's first wave subsided. The collapse of law and governance became visible as rulers themselves died or fled. In some places, city councils ceased meeting, their members dead or too afraid to gather. Royal courts suspended their sessions. In England, King Edward III tried to project stability, but his court was not immune, and his attempts to control events through ordinances soon revealed how fragile authority could be. Lawlessness grew in the countryside, with bands of thieves preying on abandoned villages or deserted roads. Soldiers, unemployed from wars, paused by pestilence, turned to pillage. For ordinary people, security, once fragile but real, disappeared almost overnight. Despite the despair, some subtle changes began to take root in these same years of collapse. Survivors found themselves in a world with fewer neighbours, fewer competitors, fewer masters. A serf who once bowed to his lord now found that no one remained to enforce the old rules. A widow who had buried her husband might suddenly inherit his lands, managing them herself. Children, scarce and precious, were treated with new care. Though much was chaos, beneath the ruins, seeds of transformation lay hidden. By 1349, it was clear that daily life as it had been lived before 1347 was gone. The web of obligations and customs that structured the medieval world had torn. What replaced it was uncertain, a limbo between old order and new. To walk through a city then was to pass streets of shuttered shops, to see weeds sprouting between paving stones, to hear only the creak of empty carts where once the laughter of apprentices rang out. To walk through the countryside was to find orchards abandoned, fields overgrown, and cottages with doors swinging open to the wind. The collapse of daily life was not only material but psychological. Survivors carried grief etched into their memories. The faces of loved ones, the smell of burning herbs, the silence of empty villages. The trauma of these years lingered in poems, in chronicles, in sermons. To live through 1,000, 348 and 1349, was to feel time itself broken, to feel the weight of history pressing down. It was an ending, though few could yet imagine what might begin in its place. Faith and desperation, 1349. The year 1349 was perhaps the darkest of all, for it was then that the Black Death reached its terrible crescendo across much of Europe. In that year, death was everywhere, and yet so too was a profound desperation for meaning. For medieval people, faith was the anchor of life. Every village, every city quarter, every guild and brotherhood revolved around the rhythm of the church. From baptism to burial, one's life was bound by bells and blessings. Yet when the pestilence swept through in waves too vast for priests to manage and too merciless for prayers to halt, faith itself became both a refuge and a trial. Churches, once the centre of communal life, now overflowed with mourners and supplicants. In Paris, Florence, London, Cologne, and countless smaller towns, the stone walls echoed with endless chants. Candles burned at all hours, their smoke staining vaults with soot, their flames flickering in draughty aisles where people huddled together. They prayed to Saint Sebastian, long invoked against plague, Roche, whose story of healing would soon spread, the Virgin Mary, protector of the suffering. Processions wound through narrow streets, bearing relics and icons, men and women barefoot, some dressed in sackcloth. Bells rang day and night, calling the living to beg for mercy, even as corpses were borne past the church doors. Yet desperation also revealed itself in extremes. Some clung to the church with renewed zeal, while others recoiled, seeing its clergy fall as helplessly as their flocks. Priests were often among the first to perish, for they heard confessions and administered last rites, bending close to fevered lips. Entire monasteries were emptied. Convents that had sung daily offices fell silent as nuns succumbed. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI was forced to consecrate the Rhone River itself, so bodies could be buried in its waters, for cemeteries could not suffice. He sat surrounded by fires, believing that flames might purify the air. Even the Vicar of Christ was reduced to fearful measures. This erosion of clerical authority created cracks in faith's foundation. Some whispered that the church had failed. If indulgences and prayers could not stop the pestilence, then perhaps other answers must be sought. Rumours circulated of corrupted priests, of bishops fleeing their dioceses, of monasteries hoarding wealth while the poor starved. Though many clergy died bravely, the failures of others left scars of disillusionment that would echo for centuries, feeding doubts that much later would burst into full reformation. In the meantime, ordinary people sought desperate remedies. Physicians advised strange measures. To avoid baths, for water might open the pores to infection, to carry sweet-smelling herbs and posies against the stench of corrupted air, to bleed patients or apply leeches. Some drank potions of crushed emeralds, believing jewels held power. Others burned sulphur or carried incense, hoping to cleanse the air. In cities, bonfires blazed at crossroads, their smoke curling upward in a vain attempt to chase away invisible corruption. None of it worked. Each morning brought new corpses, new cries, new graves. Superstition took root where medicine failed. Astrologers claimed that a rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter and Mars in 1345 had poisoned the air. Pamphlets spread these ideas, convincing many that the heavens themselves had turned against humanity. Others feared miasma, bad air arising from swamps or rotting matter. Some towns banned certain foods, believing they might invite disease. In desperation, logic itself was twisted, and suspicion fell upon neighbours, strangers, and above all, minorities. Jews were accused of poisoning wells, though they too perished in equal measure. In Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne, entire Jewish communities were massacred in 1349. The cries of the dying mingled with the chants of executioners who believed they were purging evil from their midst. Faith was no longer simply a source of comfort. It became a weapon wielded in fear. Among the most striking expressions of desperation were the flagellants. These bands of penitents, often dressed in white robes marked with crosses, appeared first in Germany in 1348 and spread rapidly by 1349. They marched barefoot through towns, chanting hymns, their voices low and rhythmic, echoing against stone walls. At appointed moments, they cast themselves upon the ground and beat their backs with knotted whips until the cobblestones were spattered with blood. Onlookers gasped at the sight, men and women, their flesh torn open, groaning in unison, convinced that their suffering might atone for the sins of mankind. They believed that by inflicting pain upon themselves, they might divert God's wrath and spare the world. For some, these processions were hypnotic, a terrifying yet strangely compelling theatre of devotion. For others, they were heretical, condemned by Pope Clement VI, who feared they undermined church authority. Still, they continued, moving from town to town, carrying both fervour and fear. At the personal level, faith and desperation mingled in daily life. Mothers pressed rosaries into their children's hands, whispering Ave Marias as they tucked them into bed, not knowing if dawn would find them alive. Farmers blessed their fields, even when no ploughs turned the soil. Merchants made bequests to the church, endowing masses for their souls, hoping to purchase eternal safety even as their earthly goods crumbled. Rich and poor alike carried talismans, medals, scraps of parchment inscribed with holy words. The boundary between sacred ritual and superstition blurred, for in a world unraveling, people clutched at anything that might promise protection. Communal responses varied by region. In Florence, Boccaccio described how some formed brigate, small groups of young men and women who withdrew together, feasting and singing in gardens, believing pleasure might ward off despair. In London, processions carried relics of St. Erkenwald and other saints through silent streets, the faithful trailing in long lines behind. In the Low Countries, villagers gathered in meadows to pray beneath open skies, fearing their churches were cursed by death. Everywhere, the desperation was palpable. People oscillated between hope and hopelessness, between piety and wild abandon. One of the deepest transformations was the way the Black Death altered the imagination of death itself. Before the plague, medieval Christianity emphasized death as a passage painful but dignified, accompanied by the sacraments, followed by burial in consecrated ground. By 1349, this image was shattered. Death came suddenly, without ritual, without priests, without family. Corpses were dragged away by carts, dumped into pits. Survivors were haunted not only by grief but by dread of improper burial, of souls wandering untended. Artists began to depict the macabre, skeletal figures dancing with the living, grinning skulls leading nobles and peasants alike. The dance macabre, born of plague years, became a reminder that no rank or ritual could shield against fate. And yet, even amid despair, there were moments of resilience. In villages where priests had died, lay people sometimes gathered to pray together, sustaining one another with shared words. In monasteries where only a handful remained, the survivors continued to chant the hours, their voices thin but steady. Faith was not extinguished, it was transformed, reshaped by fire. For some, it became a private inner solace, a quiet trust that endured even when the church faltered. For others, it became an urgent demand for justice, fueling movements that would echo in revolts yet to come. By the end of 1349, Europe was not only devastated by loss but also reshaped by its spiritual upheaval. The collapse of clerical certainty, the rise of fanatic movements, the scapegoating of communities, and the spread of fear all revealed how fragile the old order had been. Faith remained, but it was scarred. Desperation lingered, casting long shadows over the years ahead, and in that uneasy mixture of belief and doubt, the seeds of profound change were quietly sown, seeds that would one day alter the very structure of society. The plague in England, 1349-1350, when the pestilence crossed the Channel and settled upon England in the summer of 1348, few could imagine the depth of ruin it would bring in the year that followed. By 1349, the The island kingdom, so long proud of its green fields and thriving market towns, stood on the brink of collapse. England had already endured war with France and internal strife, but nothing in memory compared to the devastation of the Black Death. The disease first appeared in Dorset, carried most likely by sailors or merchants who had sailed from infected ports of Gascony or Flanders. From there, it spread swiftly along the southern coast. Melcombe Regis, today's Weymouth, is often named as the landing point, though no single port could claim that burden alone. Once the contagion reached the docks, there was no barrier strong enough to contain it. Rats scurried ashore from ships, fleas leapt unseen, and within weeks the pestilence fanned out into the countryside. By late 1348, it had reached Bristol, then the second largest city in England, and by early 1349 it pressed into the heart of the realm. London, the beating heart of England's commerce and governance, felt its first touch in the spring of 1349. The city, with perhaps 80,000 souls, became a place of horror. Chroniclers describe streets lined with shuttered houses, doors marked with crude crosses, carts creaking under the weight of corpses. The bells of St. Paul's tolled incessantly, until the sound itself became a dirge, a reminder that death was never more than a street away. Priests walked from house to house until they collapsed, exhausted or infected, and still the dead multiplied. Mass graves opened outside the city walls, filled with hundreds at a time. The great cemetery at Smithfield and the new burial ground at East Smithfield grew into seas of earth mounds and crude wooden markers. The countryside fared no better. In village after village, half or more of the inhabitants perished. Whole hamlets vanished from the rolls of manorial records. Ploughs rusted in the fields where oxen wandered untended. Sheep grazed on abandoned plots, their bleating the only sound in places where bells had once rung and laughter had once carried. By 1350, chroniclers estimated that perhaps 1 in 3, even 1 in 2 English people were gone. Exact numbers are lost to time, but the scale of loss is certain. Millions were dead in little more than a year. The social consequences were immediate and profound. In the manorial system that had long bound serfs to their lords, the balance of labour and land was delicate. Fields needed hands, and lords needed tenants. When tenants died in staggering numbers, lords faced barren lands and empty coffers. Survivors suddenly held leverage unimaginable before the plague. A ploughman, once expected to serve under strict dues and rents, could now demand wages to till another's land. A shepherd, scarce and valuable, could move to a manor offering better terms. Labourers, for the first time in centuries, tasted bargaining power. This shift was not welcomed by the ruling classes. In 1349, as the plague still raged, King Edward III and his council issued the Ordinance of Labourers. It sought to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, ordering every able-bodied person under 60 to accept employment at the same pay they had received before the mortality. To refuse was to risk imprisonment. The ordinance revealed the desperation of the elite, who feared that the very foundations of their feudal order were crumbling beneath them. But decrees could not change the reality that men and women, fewer in number and therefore more precious, would seize the chance to improve their lot. Daily life in plague-stricken England was marked by contradictions between fear and necessity, faith and despair, grief and survival. Markets struggled. Bread, once plentiful, sometimes grew scarce as bakers died or grain rotted in fields. Yet in other places, survivors found themselves surrounded by abundance, inheriting lands and goods from kin who had perished. Widows suddenly held property in their own names. Children inherited flocks beyond their parents' imagining. For some it was ruin, for others an unlooked-for transformation. The records of the time reveal haunting glimpses of the human experience. At Bishop's Lynn in Norfolk, officials noted the deaths of nearly all the town's leaders in a matter of weeks. In Winchester, monks scribbled hurried notes in margins, recording how their brothers fell one after another. At Ely, The cathedral cloisters echoed with silence as canons succumbed. London's courts suspended their sessions, for judges and jurors alike were absent or dead. Life itself seemed paused, caught between the weight of the past and the uncertainty of any future. Yet, even in these desperate years, some forms of continuity persisted. Marriages were hastily arranged, for widowers and widows sought companionship and stability. New tenants were installed in abandoned houses. Fields were eventually resown. The rhythm of the church continued, though thinly staffed. In cathedrals like Canterbury, where the shrine of St. Thomas Becket had long drawn pilgrims, offerings dwindled, but candles were still lit, prayers still whispered. Humanity endured, stubbornly clinging to order amid the collapse. The psychological toll was immense. Chroniclers wrote of people so afraid of contagion that they abandoned their families. Mothers left sick children, sons fled from fathers. Others, by contrast, displayed selfless courage, nursing kin until they themselves succumbed. The contradictions of human behavior, fear, faith, cruelty, compassion, were laid bare in the crucible of the plague. By the end of 1350, when the great first wave had largely spent itself, England was not the same realm it had been 2 years earlier. Its population had been shorn away, leaving gaps in villages, in guilds, in families, in the very memory of communities. The social order had cracked, and though the monarchy and nobility strove to patch it, the long-term effect would be lasting. The Black Death had torn open the structure of feudal life, and through those tears would seep new possibilities of higher wages, of social mobility, of challenge to the old hierarchies. The plague in England was not merely a season of death, it was a turning point. It forced changes upon a society that had believed itself stable, revealing that beneath the weight of tradition lay currents of transformation. These currents would swell in the decades ahead, rising into open revolt, reshaping law, labour, and life itself. For now, though, the survivors mourned and endured, haunted by the silence of their emptied villages and the memory of a year when England itself seemed to falter and fade into shadow. Wages and survival, 1350, 1351. In the quiet that followed the first great wave of the plague, England seemed like a wounded body slowly regaining breath, though its strength would never return as it had been before. The years 1350 and 1351 were years of reckoning. The bells no longer tolled with the frantic regularity of the worst months, and yet the sound of loss lingered in every village and city street. Fields that had been left wild began to be cleared again. Cottages stood empty, but were gradually claimed by survivors. Life was not restored to what it had been, but it pressed onward, reshaped by scarcity. The most pressing change was in the realm of labour. In 1347, before the plague had reached England, the island's population may have numbered around 5 million. By the end of 1350, that number may have fallen by as much as half. In certain counties, chroniclers noted that scarcely 1 in 3 households remained intact. This loss was not distributed evenly. Some villages lost only a portion of their people, while others were so devastated that they disappeared entirely from the rolls of taxation. For lords and abbots who depended on regular harvests, this collapse in population presented a crisis more profound than any raid, rebellion, or failed crop. Labour had always been the cornerstone of feudal society. The serf, bound to the land, provided services and dues to the lord. Tenants cultivated the domain fields, paid rents in grain or coin, and upheld the agricultural cycle that sustained manor and kingdom alike. When death thinned the ranks of peasants, the delicate balance shattered. Fields lay fallow, barns stood half-filled, and manorial incomes dwindled. To survive, lords needed workers. But workers were now scarce, and scarcity shifted power. A surviving ploughman could suddenly choose between manors. If one lord offered poor wages or heavy duties, another might provide better terms. Shepherds and herdsmen became prized, their knowledge essential to protect dwindling flocks. Women, too, found opportunities, taking on tasks once barred to them, stepping into roles left vacant by fathers, brothers, or husbands. A widow with strong arms might plough, a daughter might tend sheep, and in towns, guilds faced the question of whether to admit women as substitutes for men lost to plague. Survival pressed the boundaries of custom. Wages, as a result, rose rapidly. Where once a reaper might earn a penny a day, now he might demand 2 or even 3. Masons, carpenters, and skilled artisans commanded sums unheard of before the mortality. In some places, servants who had lived for little more than food and shelter now sought coin, and employers, desperate, agreed. The old order groaned under this new reality. The crown and nobility responded with alarm. They feared that the foundations of society, hierarchy, obligation, and obedience were being eroded. King Edward III, mindful of the discontent among his nobles, issued the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349. Its words carried the force of royal command, decreeing that every man and woman of England under 60 years of age must work at the same wages as before the plague. It forbade lords from luring away the workers of others with higher pay, and it threatened punishment for those who refused to serve. By 1351, the statute had been hardened into law. The Statute of Labourers, passed by Parliament, reinforced the ordinance with fines and penalties. But law written on parchment could not undo the reality of empty villages and desperate demand. Enforcers struggled to apply the statute evenly. Sheriffs might fine a reaper for demanding more, but in another county the same reaper might be quietly welcomed with higher pay, for without him the harvest would rot. Lords themselves, though beneficiaries of the statute, sometimes broke it in practice, offering inducements in secret to secure labourers for their own demands. The very men who called for stability betrayed it in order to survive. For the common people, these years brought both hardship and possibility. On the one hand, food remained uncertain, and fear of the pestilence's return lingered in every household. On the other, survivors found themselves in possession of land, tools, and animals that once belonged to their kin. A young couple, once burdened with dues and service, might now inherit fields enough to sustain them independently. Families once lowly might climb the ladder of rural society in a single generation. It was a transformation born of tragedy, but no less real. Chroniclers provide glimpses of this shift. In the accounts of manors from Norfolk, Oxfordshire, and Kent, stewards noted with frustration the difficulty of finding tenants. Entries repeat the phrase, "Land remains untilled, no tenants found." Elsewhere, the same records note payments to labourers far above the customary rate. In London, guild rolls show the admission of apprentices whose fathers had died, the city adjusting its rules to the practicalities of survival. The Black Death, which had cut down so many, left behind a new world where labourers were no longer simply subjects to command, but participants in a new form of negotiation. The church, too, was touched by this change. With clergy decimated, replacements were needed. Men of humbler origins, less schooled and less trained, were advanced to holy orders. The quality of pastoral care, lamented by bishops, may have declined, but access to the priesthood widened. A farm boy who might never have risen beyond serfdom could now aspire to wear the cassock. Authority in the spiritual, as well as temporal realm, shifted in subtle but enduring ways. The fear among elites was not misplaced. If peasants grew accustomed to higher wages, if servants learned to bargain, if tenants discovered that they could refuse poor conditions and walk away, then the old bonds of feudalism weakened. Already, murmurs of defiance were heard. In some manors, peasants refused to render customary services, offering coin instead. Others abandoned holdings entirely, leaving lords scrambling to attract replacements. This mobility, though limited by law, proved difficult to suppress in practice. By 1351, when the Great Parliament gathered to pass the Statute of Labourers, the struggle was clear. The plague had tilted the balance of power. The statute sought to restore the old equilibrium, but it was a fragile dam against a rising tide. In the years ahead, that tide would swell into open conflict. For now, though, the story of wages and survival was one of adjustment, of negotiation, and of a society beginning to recognize that the death of millions had reordered its very structure. And yet, amid these shifts, daily life retained its rhythm. Peasants sowed barley and wheat, children played in manor yards, shepherds followed their flocks. Markets opened again, though smaller than before. Bells rang once more for weddings, not only funerals. A strange calm lay upon the land, the calm of a people who had endured catastrophe and were slowly learning to live within its aftermath. The memory of 1349 remained raw, but the year 1351 revealed the beginnings of change that neither king nor parliament could fully control. The Black Death had not only thinned the population of England, it had thinned the very cords that bound peasant to lord, worker to master. In the spaces left by the dead, something new began to grow. A sense of agency, of worth, of possibility. It was faint, fragile, but undeniable, and it would carry forward into the struggles of the coming decades, reshaping the destiny of England in ways that none in 1351 could yet imagine. The Ordinance of Labourers, 1351, the year 1351 stands as a hinge in the history of England, not because the plague had finished its grim harvest, for its shadow lingered, and its return was feared, but because Parliament sought to make law serve as a shield against the upheaval the plague had set loose. The Ordinance of Labourers, first proclaimed by royal command in 1349, was now confirmed and expanded into statute, meant to hold society together as it threatened to drift apart. Yet the very act of lawmaking revealed both the desperation of the powerful and the futility of their efforts. In the stately halls where Parliament gathered, the survivors of the Great Mortality knew all too well the scale of loss. Many who sat in council had seen their own households diminished, their villages emptied, their incomes shriveled. To them, the crisis was not only human but financial. With half their tenants gone, with rents unpaid and fields unploughed, they faced ruin. The natural instinct of the elite was to command, to reassert authority where custom had always been sufficient. If wages were rising beyond measure, then the law must bind them down. If workers walked away from their lords, then the law must tie them fast. The Statute of Labourers decreed, in the king's name, that no servant, labourer, craftsman or reaper should receive more than had been customary before the plague. Wages were to remain fixed at pre-1346 levels, a legal attempt to freeze time, as if the catastrophe could be walled off and the world restored by decree. The statute threatened imprisonment for those who disobeyed, and fines for lords who tempted workers with higher pay. Beggars who could work but refused were ordered to return to service, and idleness itself was condemned as a sin against the realm. But parchment and wax were weak weapons against hunger and scarcity. In the fields of Norfolk, in the meadows of Kent, in the streets of London, the daily reality did not bend so easily. A ploughman who knew that his neighbour earned double would not remain content with his old wage. A mason whose skill could raise the walls of a church knew he could demand more, for another parish would gladly pay. Women, too, whose husbands had perished, sought employment in roles once denied to them, and they often found lords willing to ignore the letter of the statute in order to have their fields worked and their flocks tended. Evidence from manorial rolls in the 1352 shows both compliance and defiance. In some places, fines were levied against labourers who conspired together to raise wages, suggesting that workers were already organising informally to resist the statute. In others, lords paid more than the legal maximum, disguising the excess as gifts or bonuses. A reaper might receive a penny in wages and another penny in ale money. A servant might be listed as given clothing or food of a value far above the law's allowance. The statute, rather than restoring order, fostered hypocrisy, and evasion. For the peasants and workers themselves, the statute was a daily reminder that the ruling classes feared their new power. To be fined for seeking fair pay, to be threatened with imprisonment for moving to another manor, bred resentment. The sense of injustice simmered quietly, and though rebellion did not come at once, the seeds were sown. The very language of the statute, condemning workers for greed and malice, revealed the contempt with which the lords regarded those upon whom they depended. In the towns, guilds faced a similar strain. Apprentices who had survived expected to inherit the tools and workshops of their fathers, but the guilds resisted the swelling numbers. To limit entry, they too leaned on the statute, invoking its language to restrict wages and control competition. Yet necessity could not always be denied. Masters who needed hands to complete contracts bent their own rules, taking on labourers at rates the law forbade. Even in London, where the Crown's presence was strongest, the statute could not wholly erase the pressures of scarcity. The Church, diminished by the death of so many clerics, also felt the weight of this statute. Chaplains and parish priests demanded higher stipends, and bishops, though reluctant, were forced to comply. The law forbade such increases, yet the souls of the living could not be tended without priests, and so the commands of Parliament were quietly ignored in the very heart of Christendom. The dissonance between proclamation and practice widened. Edward III, still engaged in the 100 Years' War with France, relied on a steady flow of income and supply from his realm. The statute was not only about preserving social hierarchy, but also about sustaining the war effort. Without labour to harvest crops, without stable rents, the Crown's revenues faltered. By fixing wages, Edward sought to reassure both nobility and treasury. But the common people, already weary from years of disease, saw only further burden. The irony of the Statute of Labourers was that it attempted to enforce a past that no longer existed. The year 1346, before the plague, was gone forever. The survivors inhabited a different England, emptier, more fluid, more open to mobility. To compel them backward was to deny reality itself. Over the decades, as plague returned in later waves, the statute would be reiterated, amended, and reissued, a testament not to its success, but to its failure. A law repeated is a law defied. And yet, for all its futility, the statute mattered. It revealed the fear of the ruling elite, the growing boldness of the common worker, and the fault lines that would erupt in open revolt by 1381. It was, in a sense, the first acknowledgement that feudal bonds could no longer contain the shifting weight of society. The Black Death had not only cut lives short, it had accelerated the transformation of an entire economic order. By 1351, the immediate terror of the plague had ebbed, but in its place lay a quieter struggle, a contest over wages, rights, and dignity. The statute was one answer, wielded by those who clung to power. The peasants and workers, though still subdued, carried another answer in their hearts. In time, their voices would be heard in the fields, in the courts, and finally in rebellion. For now, the statute hung over England like a brittle shield, fragile against the storm of change that pressed inexorably forward. The Great Mortality's return, 1361, 1362, the Black Death had not been a single storm, but a season that returned. By 1361, a generation had passed since the first Great Mortality. Children had been born into a world where half the population was gone, and the memory of 1348 lingered like a scar carved into collective memory. Some thought the pestilence had been God's once-and-for-all punishment, a scourge never to be repeated. Others, more cautious, whispered that it could return at any moment, for sin had not ceased, nor had the air been cleansed. Their fears proved true, for in 1361, 1362, death returned with merciless familiarity. This second visitation, often called the Children's Plague, did not strike with quite the same overwhelming ferocity as the first, yet its cruelty was sharpened by its target. Where the initial wave had cut down men and women of every age, this resurgence seemed to fall especially upon the young, upon those who had been spared as infants or born in the years after the devastation. In villages across England, France, and beyond, the laughter of children was once again silenced. Entire classrooms of pupils perished, leaving schools empty and parents hollow-eyed. Chroniclers described it with sorrow deeper than before, for this was not merely the loss of neighbours, but of the future itself. In London, the plague's return revealed how fragile the city remained. The rebuilding of trade, the cautious revival of markets, the tentative hope that the worst had passed, all were struck down in weeks. Parish records from 1,361 show burials climbing again to numbers that seemed almost unthinkable, though not so astronomical as the first wave. Still, for a city already weakened, it was enough to bring commerce to a halt, to empty the courts, and to send nobles fleeing once more into the countryside. Monks noted grimly that the bells which had fallen silent for a decade tolled again, heavier than ever. In the countryside, the blow was even harsher. Many manors had only just begun to recover from the labour shortages of the 1342nd. Children were raised with the expectation that they would one day fill the roles of their parents ploughing, weaving, tending livestock, or entering service. Yet the plague's second wave tore through those hopes. A lord who had relied upon the survival of peasant families to restore his fields suddenly found himself bereft of heirs. A reeve who had carefully balanced the work of his manor saw his calculations collapse. With fewer young people to step into adulthood, the spiral of labour scarcity deepened. The psychological effect was immense. In 1348, people had spoken of the end of the world. In 1361, they spoke of the impossibility of escape. To endure a single catastrophe might be survivable, but to endure its repetition seemed unbearable. Parents buried children, masters buried apprentices, monks buried novices. The rhythm of death seemed poised to return again and again, as if life itself had become unstable. Chroniclers used words like perpetua mortalitas, a perpetual mortality that described not one event, but a cycle. In France, still embroiled in the 100 Years' War, the plague's return compounded national weakness. Armies already diminished, lost still more men. Villages, tasked with supplying troops and taxes, faltered under the renewed burden of loss. The Dauphiné saw entire districts underpopulated, their children gone. Chroniclers noted with bitter irony that while war might kill 1,000, plague killed tens of thousands, indifferent to banners or crowns. In England, King Edward III faced a realm grown weary. The Statute of Labourers had already strained the patience of common people. Now, with the deaths of the younger generation, lords felt their labour force shrinking even further. Their attempts to enforce the statute grew harsher. Families who had lost sons and daughters were still expected to supply workers to the manor fields. Resistance, often subtle, began to mount. Some families abandoned their holdings altogether, leaving behind cottages to seek freer terms elsewhere. The disappearance of children meant that many households could not fulfill obligations, and feudal lords began to see that the very structure of service was cracking. The plague of 1361-1362 also exposed the vulnerability of the clergy. Many priests who had survived the first wave had grown old, and their replacements were often the very young, those now struck down. Parishes across England and France found themselves without pastors. In desperation, bishops ordained youths scarcely trained, sometimes only 14 or 15 years old, to fill the pulpits. The spiritual guidance of Europe weakened, and with it the confidence of the people. When the priests themselves died in great numbers, questions grew sharper. How could the Church promise protection when its own shepherds fell as easily as their flock? In Italy, chroniclers in Florence recalled the sights with grim resignation. Where the first plague had been greeted with astonishment and terror, the second was met with weary despair. Houses that had once been rebuilt were abandoned again. The merchant class, who had just begun to restore trade, watched as partners and heirs fell ill. Contracts lapsed, debts were left unpaid. The fragility of recovery was laid bare. The name Children's Plague became etched in memory because of the sheer devastation it wrought upon the youth. The next generation, expected to inherit both burdens and opportunities, was instead buried. It was said in some villages that whole lineages ended in a single season. The absence of heirs forced changes in inheritance, with land passing sideways to cousins or distant kin. Legal disputes multiplied as families fought over estates. The web of feudal obligations tangled further, as lords found themselves unsure who owed what. And yet, within this sorrow, another shift occurred. Survivors, aware that life could be snatched away not once but twice, clung even more fiercely to what advantages they could gain. Labourers who survived the second pestilence demanded still higher wages, for now they were scarcer than ever. Women, having lost children, sometimes left the villages altogether to enter towns, seeking work as servants or in trade. The demographic blow not only reinforced the decline of feudalism, but also quickened the move toward a wage economy, where loyalty to a lord mattered less than the promise of coin. The plague of 1361-1362 did not match the scale of the first, but it mattered profoundly because it taught Europe that plague was not a single event. It was a cycle, an unwelcome visitor that could return whenever conditions allowed. This recognition forced rulers, priests, and peasants alike to adjust their expectations. Life was no longer a steady climb from childhood to old age, but a gamble in which entire generations might be erased. This uncertainty reshaped family life, economic choices, and the sense of destiny. In the silence after the second wave receded, Europe looked older, sadder, and more fragile. Graves filled again, fields lay untended once more, and the empty places in villages seemed even more haunting for being refilled so briefly before. The great mortality had returned, and with it the slow unravelling of the world feudal lords had known. The cracks in the old order, once hairline, were now widening into fractures. What had seemed temporary in 1348 was proving permanent. The plague was not merely a disaster of the past, it was the condition of the present. Shifting power of the serfs, 1372. By the 1372, Europe had grown accustomed to living in the shadow of the plague. The first great mortality of 1347-1351 had been followed by the second visitation of 1361-1362, and in between those years there were smaller, local flare-ups that reminded everyone that pestilence was never truly gone. Whole villages could still be struck down in weeks, market towns might lose a third of their inhabitants, and noble estates found themselves constantly replenishing a workforce that seemed always on the verge of collapse. What had once been thought of as a passing storm now revealed itself as a new climate, one of intermittent mortality, uncertainty, and fragile survival. For the serfs, who had long been bound by custom to their lords, this climate created an unexpected space for change. Feudal obligations had been constructed in a world where peasants were numerous and land was scarce. In that older balance, a lord's power rested upon the assumption that there would always be enough hands to till the fields, enough sons to inherit their father's duties, and enough obedience to keep the cycle unbroken. But by the 1372, that assumption no longer held. With every new outbreak of plague, the population dwindled further, and with each loss, the relative value of the surviving serfs increased. The shift was gradual, like the slow rising of a tide. At first, lords attempted to hold fast. They invoked ancient customs, demanded services, and enforced statutes such as the Ordinance of Labourers of 1351, which tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But enforcement proved nearly impossible. A serf might disappear in the night, leaving behind his cottage and fields, only to appear months later on another estate offering his labour for better terms. Others might simply refuse their duties, knowing that no manor reeve could compel them if too few workers remained to replace them. The threat of punishment lost its teeth when it was clear that lords themselves were desperate. Evidence from manorial rolls in England shows how rents began to be negotiated rather than imposed. Lords who once demanded week-long services in the fields sometimes agreed to accept cash payments instead. The commutation of labour into money, which had begun in earlier centuries, now accelerated rapidly. Where once a serf might owe 3 days ploughing each week, he might instead pay a small rent in coin money he could earn in the expanding market economy. In this way, the rigid ties of serfdom loosened, knot by knot, thread by thread. In France, still reeling from the devastation of the 100 Years' War and repeated waves of pestilence, similar patterns emerged. Lords who once extracted strict feudal dues from their tenants found themselves pleading for them to remain. Abandoned villages désertés became more common, their fields reverting to wildness. Chroniclers described empty hamlets where church bells no longer rang and where weeds choked the pathways between cottages. For a peasant family, this emptiness translated into opportunity. Land that had once been jealously guarded could now be claimed, leased, or bargained for. Whole farms lay waiting for those bold enough to take them. The psychological balance shifted as well. Before the plague, peasants often lived under the heavy weight of inevitability. They were born into bondage, expected to serve, and rarely imagined a life beyond their lord's domain. But after decades of pestilence, the survivors began to see themselves differently. They had endured when others had not. They had buried lords, priests, and reeves, all of whom had once seemed untouchable. They had watched entire noble lines vanish. With so much death around them, the certainty of hierarchy faltered. If even kings and bishops could be struck down, why should the word of a manor court hold eternal sway? By the 1372nd, this quiet confidence began to manifest in action. Some peasants negotiated openly, demanding lighter burdens or the forgiveness of old debts. Others migrated to towns, swelling the populations of places like London, Paris, and Florence, where work in crafts, trade, or service promised greater freedom. Guilds expanded their ranks, sometimes admitting rural migrants who would never have had such opportunities before. In towns, former serfs might find themselves apprenticed to a master carpenter, a brewer, or a weaver, identities far removed from the narrow furrows of feudal fields. The effect on lords was profound and unsettling. Manor accounts reveal mounting losses. Without enough labour to farm the domain directly, many lords resorted to leasing out parcels of land to tenants, transforming their role from feudal overseers into landlords collecting rent. This was a quieter kind of power, but for many nobles it felt like a diminution. They were no longer the unquestioned masters of a peasant workforce, but mere landlords in a shifting economic landscape. In England, this shift set the stage for tension that would soon erupt. The 1372nd witnessed rising frustration among the ruling classes at what they perceived as insolence from the lower orders. Statutes were renewed, attempting once again to bind labourers to their lords. Sumptuary laws were passed, trying to restrict what peasants could wear, for their new wealth was visible in clothing once reserved for higher ranks. Chronicles grumbled of farmhands dressing above their station, eating better meals, and even imitating the manners of their betters. For nobles accustomed to clear boundaries, this erosion of difference felt dangerous. At the same time, taxation deepened the strain. The ongoing 100 Years' War required funds, and kings turned increasingly to poll taxes, levies that fell upon rich and poor alike. For peasants already negotiating the uncertainties of plague and labour, such taxes were intolerable. They fed a growing sense of injustice, of being pressed down even as their own bargaining power rose. This contradiction, the simultaneous increase of economic leverage and political suppression, would eventually fuel open revolt. In Germany, similar patterns unfolded, though shaped by local conditions. Many regions saw the abandonment of marginal land as populations shrank and lords consolidated holdings. Some peasants took advantage of this to move to more fertile ground or to negotiate freer tenures. Others became entwined in the expanding urban economies of cities along the Rhine, where trade and crafts offered avenues beyond rural servitude. Everywhere, the old feudal bonds loosened, sometimes subtly, sometimes with open defiance. The cultural memory of the plague also reinforced these changes. Families who survived told stories of neighbours who had perished, of lords who had vanished, of priests who had fallen silent. Children raised on such stories inherited not only fear, but also an awareness that the world was mutable. Customs once thought unchangeable had already been overturned. The sense that things have always been this way no longer carried conviction. If feudal dues could be reduced in the wake of plague, why not abolished altogether? By the late 1372, this spirit of questioning was spreading. Peasants still attended manor courts, still doffed their caps to lords, still paid rents or rendered services. But beneath the outward gestures lay a new consciousness. They knew that without them, fields would lie empty. They knew their labour was precious. They knew they could walk away and find another master. This knowledge was itself a form of power, subtle but transformative. The Black Death had torn Europe's body, but in its healing it had altered the bones. Feudalism, once a sturdy structure, was now riddled with cracks. The serfs of the 1372 stood at the centre of this transformation, no longer wholly bound, not yet wholly free, but shifting steadily toward autonomy. Their choices, small and large, would ripple outward into the revolts and revolutions of the coming decades. The winds of change, once faint, were now unmistakable. The feudal order trembled, and at its heart was the quiet strength of peasants who had survived death itself, and discovered in their survival a power no lord could fully contain. The Peasants' Revolt, 1381. The summer of 1381 unfolded like a gathering storm, slow at first, then swelling into a thunderous roar that rolled across England. For decades, the aftermath of the Black Death had simmered beneath the surface of society. Serfs and peasants had grown used to their newfound leverage, demanding higher wages, lighter burdens, and sometimes outright freedom. Lords and kings, clinging to their vision of a static order, pushed back with laws, taxes, and punishments. The tension stretched year after year, taut as a bowstring, and in that summer, it finally snapped. The revolt began with a tax. The 100 Years' War dragged on, consuming silver and gold with no end in sight. The government, desperate for funds, imposed a poll tax in 1380, following similar levies in 1377 and 1379. But unlike earlier feudal dues, this tax was uniform. Every adult, rich or poor, was required to pay the same amount, 12 pence or 1 shilling. For a wealthy merchant or knight, the sum was negligible. For a poor ploughman already struggling to survive, it was intolerable. Worse still, tax collectors were often corrupt, heavy-handed, and humiliating in their methods. Chroniclers told of officials prying into households, demanding payments from children scarcely in their teens, and threatening those who protested. The resentment spread quickly through Essex and Kent, 2 counties near London where economic strain was already acute. Here, peasants were no longer the docile workers of old. They had known decades of bargaining power, of walking away from oppressive lords, of hiring themselves out for wages. They had tasted freedom, however incomplete, and were not inclined to surrender it. When the tax collectors arrived in May of 1381, they were met not with compliance, but resistance. Villagers armed themselves with staves, bows, and farm tools, driving the collectors away. From these sparks, flames rose. News of resistance travelled by word of mouth, carried along the roads and lanes by messengers, merchants, and fugitives. Soon, villages across Essex were in open defiance, and by early June the movement had swelled into a mass uprising. Ordinary men, labourers, artisans, smallholders marched under makeshift banners, Women too joined in, jeering at officials, carrying supplies and urging their families forward. The air rang with shouts of freedom, of justice, of a kingdom turned upside down. The figure who would become the face of this revolt was Wat Tyler, a man from Kent whose name would echo in chronicles for centuries. Little is known of his early life. He may have been a Tyler by trade, perhaps a soldier, perhaps both. What is clear is that he possessed a rare gift for leadership. Under his command, the rebels organized themselves into companies, marched with discipline, and drew thousands to their cause. They did not see themselves as lawless rioters, but as God's instruments, chosen to correct the corruption of a realm gone astray. By mid-June, the rebels had converged on London. The city, heart of the kingdom, lay vulnerable. Its gates opened, whether out of sympathy or fear, and soon the streets were filled with peasants carrying bows, axes, and bills. Chroniclers described the extraordinary sight of common men occupying the capital, chanting demands, and calling for the heads of corrupt officials. Their grievances were clear: an end to serfdom, the reduction of rents, the dismissal of unjust ministers, and the fairer distribution of wealth. One of the most dramatic episodes unfolded at the Tower of London itself. On the 14th of June, the young King Richard II, only 14 years old, agreed to meet the rebels at Mile End. There, in a remarkable scene, he granted their demands: freedom from serfdom, fair wages, and general pardons. The crowd rejoiced, believing that justice had been won. But even as these promises were spoken, another group of rebels stormed the tower. They seized and executed several of the king's closest advisors, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, and the treasurer, Robert Hales. Their heads were paraded on pikes through the city, grisly symbols of vengeance. The next day, the 15th of June, brought the climax. At Smithfield, outside the city walls, Wat Tyler met the king once more to press further demands. Accounts vary, but most agree that the atmosphere was tense. Tyler, perhaps emboldened by success, spoke forcefully, demanding not only the end of serfdom, but also sweeping reforms, the redistribution of church lands, the abolition of aristocratic privileges, and a new social order. To the royal councillors, this was nothing short of treason. A scuffle broke out. Some say Tyler insulted the king, others that he raised his dagger. Whatever the cause, the Mayor of London, William Walworth, struck him down, mortally wounding him. For a moment, chaos threatened. The rebel army, numbering in the tens of thousands, could have unleashed destruction upon the city. But Richard II, with remarkable composure for his age, rode forward and addressed them directly. "Sirs," he declared, "will you kill your king? I am your leader. Follow me." The words calmed the crowd, and slowly, uncertainly, they began to disperse. Without Tyler's leadership, their unity crumbled. The revolt, which had risen so swiftly, now unravelled. The aftermath was brutal. Royal forces regained control, pursuing rebels into the countryside. Leaders were hunted down and executed, their bodies displayed as warnings. In Essex, entire villages were punished. In Kent, ringleaders were hanged. The promises of freedom and pardon were revoked. Richard's earlier concessions were declared void, mere words spoken under duress. The old order reasserted itself with harsh determination, and yet the revolt could not be undone entirely. Though the immediate demands were denied, the spirit of 1,381 lingered. Lords and kings had seen, for the first time, the sheer power of the commons when united. The peasants had glimpsed their collective strength, had marched on London, had confronted their monarch face to face. Even in defeat, the memory of that summer lived on in whispers, songs, and stories. The longer legacy lay in the slow erosion of serfdom. While the revolt was crushed, the underlying forces that had given rise to it did not disappear. Labour remained scarce, wages continued to rise, and lords found it increasingly impractical to enforce old obligations. Over the next century, the bonds of serfdom would weaken further, until in many regions they vanished altogether. The dream of 1381, though bloodily suppressed, would be realized in time, not by sudden revolution but by gradual transformation. For contemporaries, the revolt was a shock that revealed the fragility of order. Chroniclers, often writing from the perspective of the elite, described it as a time when the world turned upside down, when common men dared to challenge their betters, sermons thundered against the sin of rebellion, and royal statutes sought to tighten control. Yet beneath the official condemnations lay a current of fear. The ruling classes understood that the plague had altered the balance forever. The revolt was not a random outburst, but a symptom of deeper change. The peasants of 1381 had risen not merely against taxes but against the weight of centuries. Their revolt stood as a sign that feudalism itself was cracking. Though crushed in the moment, their voices echoed into the future, carried forward in each negotiation, each wage demand, each refusal to bow unquestioningly. The Black Death had given them leverage. The revolt had given them vision. Together, these forces would ensure that the old feudal bonds would never be the same again. The fields of Essex and Kent grew quiet again in the months that followed, but the memory of rebellion lingered in the furrows. In village taverns, men spoke cautiously of Tyler and his boldness. Women remembered the excitement of those days when officials fled in terror. Children, too young to understand, grew up hearing of the summer when peasants walked proudly through London's gates. The revolt lived on not only in chronicles, but in the rhythms of daily memory, a testament to the shifting power of the common people. By the time the century ended, lords still owned their estates, kings still wore their crowns, and priests still preached obedience. But beneath the surface, the world was changing. The summer of 1381 had proved that the voice of the commons could shake the kingdom itself. The age of unquestioned feudal dominance was drawing to its twilight, and though its final collapse would take generations, the crack in the edifice had already begun to spread. Decline of feudal lords, 14th century. The 14th century carried with it a long shadow. After the fury of the Black Death and the thunder of rebellion, England and much of Europe entered a quieter but no less dramatic transformation. At its heart lay the decline of the feudal lords, those who had for centuries stood as the pillars of medieval society. Their castles had once dominated the landscape, their banners fluttered over battlefields, and their voices rang in the councils of kings. But by the latter decades of the century, these same lords found themselves weakened, their fortunes drained, their grip upon their tenants loosened. The old order, which had rested so heavily upon their authority, was slowly but surely crumbling. To understand the scale of their decline, one must recall the foundations of feudalism itself. Since the early Middle Ages, society had been bound together by a network of obligations. Lords granted land to vassals in exchange for service. Peasants, bound as serfs, tilled the soil in return for protection. Wealth was measured not in coin but in land and the labour it provided. A lord's power depended upon the number of men he could summon to fight, the number of harvests he could command, and the loyalty of those who lived upon his estates. For centuries this system had seemed unshakable, but the Black Death tore deep fissures into its very core. When plague swept across Europe in 1347-1351, the loss of life among peasants was catastrophic. In some regions, half the population perished, in others, even more. Whole villages were abandoned, fields lay fallow, and barns rotted empty. For the lords, whose wealth depended upon the steady flow of crops, rents, and dues, this was devastation. Their income shrank, while the costs of maintaining estates and households remained. At the same time, survivors among the peasantry suddenly found themselves in demand. With labour scarce, they could bargain for higher wages, freer contracts, or better terms of tenancy. Many lords resisted, clinging to the old customs, but resistance only deepened their losses. The crown attempted to assist the nobility by enforcing strict controls. The Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351 sought to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and forbid peasants from moving in search of better work. Yet these laws proved nearly impossible to enforce. Across the countryside, men and women simply walked away from their manors, taking employment with wealthier landlords or in towns. Entire estates collapsed for want of workers, and lords found themselves unable to compel obedience. The Black Death had shifted the balance, and no law, however sternly written, could undo it. Financial ruin stalked the nobility in other ways as well. War with France drained coffers as knights were summoned to campaigns across the Channel. The 100 Years' War promised glory but often delivered debt. Ransoms for captured lords, the cost of outfitting armies, and the maintenance of castles along vulnerable coasts placed immense burdens upon noble households. Many mortgaged their lands, borrowing heavily from merchants, townsmen, or the church. Some were forced to sell ancestral estates altogether, watching as the very ground their families had ruled for centuries slipped into the hands of commoners or rising gentry. The cultural image of the lord also began to tarnish. Once idealized as protectors of their tenants and defenders of the realm, many were now seen as exploiters who demanded too much while offering too little. The memory of the Peasants' Revolt in 1381 sharpened these resentments. Villagers remembered the arrogance of stewards, the cruelty of bailiffs, the weight of endless dues. The revolt may have been crushed, but the distrust it revealed never faded. Lords had shown themselves vulnerable. The aura of untouchable power was broken. Even within their own ranks, divisions widened. Some nobles adapted, shifting from traditional feudal dues to money rents, leasing their lands to tenants rather than binding them as serfs. These lords, often pragmatic and shrewd, preserved a measure of prosperity and even thrived in the new conditions. Others, however, clung stubbornly to the old ways, insisting on labour services and ancient rights. Their manners fell into disrepair, their tenants deserted them, and their influence waned. The gap between progressive and traditional lords widened, reshaping the aristocracy itself. In the towns, meanwhile, new centres of power were rising. Merchants, guild leaders, and wealthy burghers accumulated fortunes that rivaled and sometimes exceeded those of landed nobles. Trade, both local and international, flourished despite the chaos of plague and war. Italian bankers, Flemish cloth merchants, and English wool exporters built networks of wealth that the feudal system had never envisioned. Nobles who once scorned commerce found themselves borrowing from it, dependent upon the very class they had dismissed as lesser. The balance of society tilted, subtly but irreversibly, toward money rather than land. The church, too, played its part in this transformation. Monasteries had suffered terribly in the plague years, losing entire communities of monks and nuns. Yet in the decades after, ecclesiastical landlords often proved more efficient in managing estates than lay lords. Bishops and abbots employed stewards, accountants, and lawyers to safeguard revenues, while many lay nobles relied on outdated practices. As a result, some church lands prospered, even as noble estates languished. This only deepened the sense of decline among the aristocracy, who saw their traditional dominance challenged from every side. Culturally, the decline of the lords was mirrored in the shifting ideals of the age. The chivalric code, with its tournaments, jousts, and knightly oaths, seemed increasingly hollow against the backdrop of plague and rebellion. Chronicles that once celebrated noble valour began to record the suffering of ordinary people. Poets and preachers alike spoke of the vanity of earthly power, of the equality of all before death. The dance macabre, painted on church walls, showed kings and peasants alike dragged into the grave. It was a haunting reminder that noble blood conferred no immunity, and that the old hierarchies were fragile indeed. By the closing years of the 14th century, the feudal lords remained visible, their castles still dotting the landscape, their names still commanding respect. But beneath the surface, their foundations were eroding. The Black Death had slashed their incomes, the peasants had grown bolder, and the rising middle classes had seized opportunities once closed to them. What had once been the unchallenged dominance of the nobility was now a contested space, where wealth, law, and influence flowed in new directions. The decline was not a sudden collapse, but a slow withering like ivy creeping over stone. In some regions, noble families endured, adapting and surviving. In others, they disappeared entirely, their estates broken up, their titles forgotten. What mattered was the trajectory, downward for the lords, upward for those beneath them. The world was tilting, and the balance of power was shifting away from the feudal aristocracy. For the peasants, this decline meant opportunity. Though still burdened, still poor, they could now negotiate, move, and choose in ways their ancestors had not. For kings, it meant a chance to centralize authority, relying less upon fractious lords and more upon loyal officials. For merchants and townsmen, it meant doors opening into the spheres of power once closed. The decline of the lords was not merely their tragedy, it was the reshaping of society itself. By the dawn of the 15th century, the echoes of this change were unmistakable. The nobility was still present, but no longer supreme. Feudalism, as it had been known for centuries, was waning, and though its final dissolution would come slowly, its fate had been sealed in the fields abandoned after the plague, in the villages that dared to revolt, and in the weary halls of castles that could no longer command the labour of a nation. A new economy emerging, late 14th century. The 14th century, so often remembered for plague, war, and revolt, also carried within it the seeds of something new. Out of the devastation of the Black Death and the decline of feudal lords, a different kind of economy began to emerge. It was not born suddenly, nor was it uniform across all of Europe, but its presence grew steadily, like green shoots breaking through scorched earth. By the late 1302, the outlines of this transformation were visible. Towns swelled with commerce, money flowed more freely, and labour was increasingly exchanged for wages rather than bound by obligation. The world that had once been held in the grip of feudal dues and inherited service was loosening, making room for markets, contracts, and choice. At the heart of this shift was scarcity. When the Black Death carried away between a third and a half of Europe's population, it left vast stretches of land untended, houses empty, and workshops silent. Survivors faced a paradox. With fewer hands to till the soil or spin the wool, productivity declined, yet those who remained were more valuable than ever. For peasants and artisans, this meant bargaining power. No longer chained to their lords by fear of starvation, many could negotiate wages, demand reduced rents, or simply move to where conditions were better. Lords who resisted found themselves abandoned, their lands leased instead to those willing to embrace new terms. Money, once peripheral in a world of barter and service, rose to prominence. As lords shifted from labour dues to cash rents, and as wages replaced forced obligations, coin became the lifeblood of exchange. Silver pennies, groats, and florins changed hands in markets, taverns, and guild halls. In England, the wool trade boomed, with fleeces shipped to the looms of Flanders, fueling prosperity in both regions. Italian bankers facilitated these exchanges, creating networks of credit and finance that stretched across the continent. Towns like Florence, Bruges, and London pulsed with activity, their streets alive with merchants and craftsmen, their squares ringing with the calls of buyers and sellers. The growth of towns played a crucial role in this new economy. Urban centres, though struck hard by the plague, proved remarkably resilient. In their crowded alleys and busy marketplaces, opportunities multiplied. Guilds organised labour, regulating prices and quality, but also providing protection and solidarity to their members. Apprenticeship systems drew young men from the countryside, eager to learn trades that promised stability. Women too found roles in brewing, textiles, and household services, carving niches in economies once dominated by male labour. Cities became magnets, drawing people away from the rural manners that had long defined medieval life. For the nobility, this shift was unsettling. They had built their power upon land and its yields, Yet here was a system in which wealth could be generated without their direct control. Merchants, once viewed as a lesser class, now grew rich enough to rival lords. In some towns, merchant families sponsored churches, commissioned art, and wielded political influence. The Medici of Florence, who would rise to prominence in the next century, exemplified this trend. In England, wealthy wool merchants purchased estates, entering the ranks of the gentry. The old boundaries between noble and commoner blurred, as money opened doors that birth alone had once commanded. The church, too, felt the tremors of this change. Tithes and rents, once reliable, faltered as populations shrank. Yet ecclesiastical institutions also embraced the monetary shift, leasing lands for cash or investing in trade. Monasteries sold surplus grain, wine, or wool, often competing with lay landlords in the marketplace. Cathedrals under construction slowed during the height of the plague but resumed in the later decades, funded by donations not only from nobles but from prosperous townsmen. Spiritual authority remained strong, but the church's role as an economic power was increasingly entwined with the rhythms of commerce. The legal framework of Europe also adapted. Contracts became more common, written agreements setting wages, rents, and terms of service. Courts arbitrated disputes between merchants, townsmen, and landlords. In England, statutes sought to control prices and wages, but often ended up legitimizing the very practices they tried to suppress. In towns, charters granted by kings or princes gave communities a degree of self-governance, allowing them to regulate trade, collect taxes, and organize militias. The authority of feudal lords, once absolute within their domains, was steadily replaced by civic institutions rooted in commerce and law. Travelers of the time noted the difference. Whereas once the countryside had dominated the imagination of Europe, with its fields, forests, and castles, now the towns claimed attention. Pilgrims arriving in Canterbury or Santiago passed through bustling markets. Merchants travelling from Genoa to Bruges remarked upon the wealth of urban guilds and the independence of civic councils. Chroniclers observed how common folk, enriched by labour or trade, dressed in finer clothes and lived in sturdier houses. It was a subtle but profound shift. The measure of prosperity was no longer the size of one's manor but the reach of one's trade. The plague had accelerated this transformation in unexpected ways. The sheer scale of mortality had disrupted old structures, forcing adaptation. Those who survived inherited lands, goods, or opportunities once out of reach. A peasant who might have expected to spend his life under the same lord now found himself free to lease a vacant farm, sell produce in the market, or even send a son to apprentice in town. Women, widowed by the plague, often managed farms or shops, exercising authority that would once have been denied them. Though hardship remained immense, the horizons of possibility widened. And yet, this new economy was not without tension. As peasants gained power, lords sought to reassert control through taxes, labour demands, or legislation. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 England had revealed just how explosive such tensions could be. Though suppressed, the revolt underscored that the balance of power had shifted. Workers and villagers, emboldened by scarcity, would not easily return to unquestioned submission. Their demands for fairer treatment, lighter dues, and greater freedom echoed through the countryside, pressing upon lords and kings alike. Across Europe, the broader patterns were similar, though local variations abounded. In France, the devastation of war compounded the effects of plague, weakening the nobility further. In Italy, city-states such as Florence and Venice grew into powerful economic hubs, their fortunes built on banking and trade. In the Low Countries, cloth production flourished, drawing English wool and spreading prosperity across towns. In Germany, the Hanseatic League knit together ports of the Baltic and North Seas, creating a network of commerce that bypassed traditional feudal structures. Everywhere, money, contracts, and markets were supplanting the older bonds of lord and serf. By the closing decades of the 14th century, it was clear that Europe was no longer the same society it had been before the plague. The outlines of feudalism remained, with castles still dotting the countryside and lords still wielding authority. But the current of change was undeniable. Towns thrived, merchants prospered, and peasants negotiated. The old hierarchy was bending beneath the weight of new realities, reshaped by forces that no decree or sword could halt. It would take centuries for feudalism to vanish entirely, but its decline was now irreversible. The Black Death had torn away millions of lives, but in its wake, it had also torn open possibilities. The survivors built a world in which wealth could be earned, contracts could be signed, and communities could govern themselves. It was a quieter revolution than rebellion or war, yet its impact was deeper, reshaping the very structure of European life. Thus, in the late 14th century, amid the echoes of plague bells and the ruins of abandoned villages, a new economy was stirring. Its rhythms were different, measured not by the obligations of birth but by the exchanges of labour and money. Its spirit was different, driven not solely by custom but by ambition and opportunity, and its legacy would reach far beyond the century, laying the foundations for the Renaissance, for capitalism, and for the modern world to come. From feudalism to freedom, 15th century. The 15th century opened with a Europe that still bore scars of plague and war, yet also carried the momentum of profound change. The long shadow of the Black Death had not vanished, for new outbreaks flared in cities and villages, each wave a grim reminder of the century past. But within these cycles of loss, a deeper transformation was unfolding. Feudalism, the system of obligations that had bound lords and peasants for centuries, was weakening. In its place, new forms of freedom were emerging, tentative yet undeniable, shaping the destiny of Europe in ways that would echo into modern times. At the heart of this transformation lay the gradual erosion of serfdom. Once, the majority of Europe's rural population had been tied to the land, compelled to work fields not their own, to pay dues in labour and produce, and to submit to the authority of their lords. But as the 15th century progressed, these obligations loosened. Many peasants secured charters of freedom, often by paying a fixed sum to their lords. Others simply walked away, abandoning unprofitable manners to seek better terms elsewhere. Lords, facing chronic shortages of labour, increasingly allowed such arrangements rather than risk leaving their fields entirely uncultivated. This was not a sudden liberation, nor was it universal. In Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland, Hungary and Russia, serfdom endured and in some places even tightened. But in Western Europe, in England, France, the Low Countries and parts of Italy, the trend was clear. By the mid-15th century, the majority of peasants in England were tenants rather than serfs, renting land for money rather than being bound by custom. In France, the collapse of noble power during the 100 Years' War accelerated similar processes. In Italy, the strength of city-states and mercantile wealth created alternative opportunities that lured labourers away from rural bondage. This gradual emancipation reshaped village life. Freed from the obligation to work their lord's domain, peasants focused on their own plots, their own families, and their own markets. They produced not only for subsistence but for sale, carrying surplus grain, wool, or dairy to the nearest town. The rhythm of the seasons remained the same, the plough in spring, the harvest in autumn, but the sense of ownership altered the meaning of labour. What had once been toil for another's profit became work for one's own household and posterity. Markets, fairs and towns became more central to daily life. A freed peasant might sell barley at a weekly market, purchase iron tools from a blacksmith, or lease additional land with the proceeds. Money circulated more freely, weaving connections between countryside and town, lord and tenant, artisan and merchant. This circulation was not only economic but cultural, carrying ideas, fashions and news. The 15th century, though still deeply medieval, began to hum with a more connected, mobile energy. The nobility, long accustomed to dominance, faced an uncertain position, With fewer serfs to command, their direct control waned. Some adapted, leasing their lands for rent, investing in trade, or serving as military captains for kings and princes. Others clung stubbornly to old forms, imposing dues where they could, yet watching as tenants slipped away. In many cases, their survival depended upon aligning with the growing power of centralized monarchies. Kings and queens, themselves strengthened by the decline of independent nobles, relied upon taxation of towns and trade rather than feudal levies. Thus, the weakening of feudalism at the local level contributed to the rise of stronger, more centralized states. This shifting balance was most visible in England. By the 1402, the English crown increasingly derived revenue from customs duties on wool exports rather than from feudal obligations. Landlords, struggling to maintain their estates, leased land to prosperous tenants or enclosed it for sheep grazing, anticipating profit from the lucrative wool trade. These enclosures displaced many small farmers, but they also reflected the growing dominance of a money economy over traditional subsistence farming. In France, devastated by both the Black Death and the 100 Years' War, the nobility suffered grievously. Many estates were abandoned, and peasants who had once been bound now worked lands for rent or wages. The crown, though weakened by war, eventually emerged stronger, relying on taxation and standing armies rather than the old feudal levies. The end of serfdom in France was gradual but unmistakable, hastened by the fact that lords simply lacked the power to reimpose it. Italy, fragmented into city-states, showed the most dramatic divergence from feudal structures. Here, mercantile wealth and urban independence had long coexisted with rural lordship. But in the 15th century, cities like Florence, Venice, and Milan increasingly dominated. Wealthy merchants purchased land, but they managed it through contracts and rents, not through feudal dues. The rural poor still laboured, but their connection was economic rather than hereditary. Florence's Contado, the rural hinterland, was dotted with tenant farms producing for urban markets. Venice, master of the seas, turned its wealth toward maritime trade rather than rural lordship. Feudalism lingered in name, but had lost much of its substance. The 15th century was also marked by demographic recovery. After the devastation of the Black Death and its later recurrences, populations slowly grew once more. Fields long abandoned were reclaimed, villages resettled, and towns repopulated. Yet the memory of plague lingered, shaping attitudes toward labour, family, and community. Survivors remembered how fragile life could be, and their descendants inherited both the caution and the opportunities born of scarcity. This recovery further weakened feudalism, for as populations grew, markets expanded, and lords relied ever more upon cash rents and trade to sustain their households. In this atmosphere of change, freedom took many forms. For some, it was the literal emancipation from serfdom, recorded in charters that proclaimed a man or his heirs free from bondage. For others, it was the practical ability to move, to negotiate, to choose. Women, though still constrained, found greater room to act as landholders, widows, or business owners in towns. Young men apprenticed to trades rather than inheriting their father's plots. Families moved into towns in search of opportunity. All these choices chipped away at the rigid structure that feudalism had imposed. The intellectual world of the 15th century reflected these changes. In Italy, humanism flourished, emphasizing the worth of the individual and the potential of human achievement. Though largely confined to the educated elite, such ideas resonated with broader shifts in society, where identity was less tied to hereditary obligation and more to ability, wealth, and initiative. In Northern Europe, religious movements questioned the authority of the Church, often reflecting popular discontent with traditional hierarchies. The seeds of later Reformation and Renaissance lay intertwined with the decline of feudalism. Yet this transition was not without conflict. Peasants who sought freedom sometimes clashed with lords who refused to yield. In Germany and elsewhere, revolts erupted throughout the 15th century, echoing the unrest of earlier decades. The Hussite Wars in Bohemia, though religious in origin, were also fueled by social and economic grievances. These uprisings, though often suppressed, underscored the growing resistance to feudal bonds. The peasants might be defeated, but the structures they opposed continued to crumble regardless. By the close of the 15th century, Europe was poised upon the threshold of modernity. Feudalism had not vanished overnight, nor would it disappear entirely for centuries. But its foundations were irreparably weakened. The economy pulsed with trade, money, and contracts. Monarchies consolidated power, often in partnership with towns and merchants rather than feudal lords. Individuals experienced greater freedom of movement, greater opportunity to negotiate their place in society. Out of the trauma of plague and the ruin of old structures, a more fluid, dynamic world had emerged. This was the world in which Christopher Columbus would set sail, in which the printing press would spread knowledge, in which Renaissance art would flourish. None of these developments were possible without the gradual liberation from feudal constraints. The 15th century was thus not merely an age of recovery, but an age of profound transition. The peasants who once bent under the weight of obligation now stood, if not entirely free, at least more upright, more confident, more engaged in shaping their own futures. And so, the story of feudalism's decline was also the story of freedom's rise. Freedom in this age was imperfect, partial, often precarious. Yet, it was real enough to transform Europe's villages, towns, and kingdoms. The bonds of the past loosened, making space for the possibilities of the future. In that quiet transformation lay the promise of all that was to come. Legacy of the Black Death, beyond 1,500. The 16th century dawned with a Europe transformed in ways its 14th century ancestors could scarcely have imagined. Where once lords and peasants had lived in a rigid web of mutual obligation, now towns thrived, monarchies strengthened, and the individual found new space to move, to act, to dream. The Black Death had been the dark catalyst of these changes, an unwelcome guest that shattered feudal stability and forced new patterns upon society. Its legacy endured long after the final outbreaks subsided, shaping the birth of the Renaissance, the rise of modern states, and the slow emergence of the world we know today. The demographic consequences of the plague echoed for centuries. By 1500, Europe's population had recovered significantly from the catastrophic losses of the mid-14th century, though not evenly. Some regions, such as parts of Italy and the Low Countries, rebounded quickly thanks to fertile soil, active trade, and urban vitality. Others, like central France and swaths of England, lagged behind, their villages still scarred by abandonment. Yet across the continent, the memory of loss persisted. Families traced their lineage to survivors, and entire communities remembered the empty fields, the shuttered churches, the tolling bells that had once filled the air. This collective memory nurtured caution and resilience alike, preparing Europe for both prosperity and further crisis. Economically, the plague's long shadow had permanently altered the relationship between land, labour, and wealth. As serfdom declined in Western Europe, markets expanded. Towns grew in both size and importance, becoming centres of trade, craft, and culture. Merchant families like the Medici of Florence rose to prominence. Their fortunes built not on acres of farmland but on banking, commerce, and political influence. The old feudal aristocracy adapted unevenly. Some married into wealthy mercantile clans, merging land with capital. Others fell into decline, their estates fragmented, their power diminished. In their place, new elites emerged, tied not to castles and ploughs, but to counting houses and ships. The Renaissance itself can be seen as a child of the Black Death's disruption. With fewer mouths to feed and more wealth circulating among survivors, resources flowed into art, scholarship, and architecture. Patrons sought to leave legacies that would outlast the fragility of human life. The frescoes of Florence, the domes of Venice, the libraries of Rome all were in part responses to the deep awareness of mortality that the plague had imprinted upon Europe. Humanism, with its focus on individual potential and earthly achievement, found fertile ground in a society that had seen how quickly death could strike and how little comfort tradition sometimes provided. Politically, the weakening of feudal bonds allowed monarchies to consolidate power. In France, kings rebuilt authority after the devastation of the 100 Years' War, relying on professional armies funded by taxes rather than feudal levies. In Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella united crowns and expelled foreign powers, shaping a centralized kingdom capable of sponsoring voyages across the Atlantic. In England, the Wars of the Roses ended with the Tudors, who strengthened royal control while curbing the independence of the old nobility. These developments all traced back, in part, to the long erosion of feudal fragmentation accelerated by the plague. Lords who had once commanded loyalty from serfs and vassals now found themselves reliant upon the goodwill of kings and the flow of money, not labour. The Church, too, bore the imprint of plague and its aftermath. During the Black Death, many clergy had died ministering to the sick, while others had fled, leaving their flocks bereft. The credibility of the Church suffered, as prayers and processions failed to halt the disease. In the following centuries, doubts about ecclesiastical authority simmered. Movements like Lollardy in England and Hussitism in Bohemia reflected a restless desire for reform, fueled by both spiritual yearning and social change. By the early 16th century, Martin Luther's challenge would ignite the Protestant Reformation, a movement that cannot be separated from the centuries of upheaval begun by the plague. The Black Death had loosened bonds not only between lords and peasants but between laity and clergy, creating cracks in authority that new voices would widen. For ordinary people, the long-term legacy of the Black Death was experienced in the rhythm of daily life. Freed from the heaviest obligations of serfdom, many peasants became tenants, free to negotiate rents or move in search of better terms. Villagers cultivated land with greater independence, carried goods to expanding markets, and engaged with towns more frequently. Mobility increased. Roads once trodden mostly by merchants or pilgrims now saw the steady footsteps of labourers seeking opportunity. Women, too, found new roles, particularly in towns, where widowhood or trade could open space for economic activity. Though patriarchy remained strong, the social disruptions of plague and war had created cracks in which new possibilities grew. Not all consequences were positive. The enclosure of fields for sheep in England, driven by the profitability of wool, displaced many small farmers. Vagabondage and poverty became pressing issues, forcing governments to pass harsh laws against wandering labourers. Inequality remained stark, and exploitation took new forms even as old ones faded. In Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland and Russia, the story diverged. Landlords tightened their grip, reimposing serfdom more harshly to maintain control over scarce labour. Thus, while Western Europe moved toward freedom, Eastern Europe doubled down on bondage, a division that would shape the continent's future. The psychological impact of the plague lingered across generations. Art and literature continued to reflect an obsession with death and the fragility of life. The Dance of Death motif appeared in paintings and carvings, showing skeletons leading kings and peasants alike to the grave. Writers contemplated fate, morality, and survival. Yet alongside this, morbidity grew a vibrancy, a determination to seize life, to create beauty, to explore the world. This dual legacy, born of trauma, fueled both the melancholy of medieval memento mori and the exuberance of Renaissance creativity. By the dawn of the early modern era, Europe's path had diverged irreversibly from the feudal world. The plague's devastation had shaken foundations too thoroughly for them ever to be rebuilt as they had been. Instead, new forms of economy, politics, and culture had taken root. The rise of capitalism, the expansion of trade networks, the voyages of discovery, all were made possible by a society no longer bound in the same way to the soil and to hereditary ties. The old order had crumbled, and in its ruins, something dynamic, unpredictable, and profoundly new had emerged. Looking back, one can see the Black Death, not merely as a disaster but as a turning point. Its horror cannot be minimized. Tens of millions perished, families were destroyed, and communities collapsed. Yet from this crucible of suffering, change was forged. The end of feudalism was not sudden, nor was it uniform, but it was inexorable. The 15th and 16th centuries witnessed a Europe moving toward greater individual freedom, greater mobility, and greater possibility. The plague had forced society to adapt, and in adapting, it had created the foundations of the modern world. And so the story of the Black Death and the end of feudalism is not solely a tale of sorrow, but of transformation. It is a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, seeds of renewal can be sown. The peasants who once bent beneath their lord's demands rose to bargain, to move, to shape their destinies. The towns that once cowered in silence became centers of art and commerce. The kings who once leaned upon knights and vassals built nations that would stride into modernity. The Black Death was a terror, but it was also a threshold. The story draws to a close now, as the echoes of centuries settle into quiet. The tale of the Black Death and the slow crumbling of the feudal order has wound its way across fields and castles, through villages and cities, over oceans of fear and silence. What once seemed unshakable was altered by a force unseen, and though countless lives were lost, history moved forward, reshaping the way people lived, worked, and dreamed. In the stillness after the storm, generations found ways to rebuild. New markets blossomed, new freedoms were won, and new voices began to rise. Yet beneath all of it lay a memory of bells tolling in empty streets, of doors closed against neighbours, of prayers whispered in the dark. That memory shaped how Europe learned to live again, cautious yet resilient, fragile yet determined. Now the centuries stretch like a long horizon, and the listener may drift gently along them, hearing only the steady rhythm of time itself. The peasants who walked away from their fields, the lords who watched their power slip, the merchants who counted their coins by lamplight, they are all long gone. Their voices linger only as whispers, folded into the story of the world. And as the past settles, so too does the mind. Breath slow, the weight of history softens into calm. The rise and fall of ages is distant now, leaving only quiet lessons and gentle echoes. Rest comes easily in such silence, where nothing presses but the softness of sleep. So let the world outside fade, as the story has faded, and drift peacefully into rest. The centuries are behind you, the night is before you, and the dream is yours.